What's up, guys? Welcome to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any updates. Today's episode is going to be a little controversial. And honestly, it's one of those takes that a lot of people in the hobby might not agree with at first, and that's okay. But I think if you zoom out and you look at where the comic market has been over the last year and where it's likely heading as we move through 2026, there's a strong argument to be made that one of the biggest groups at risk of getting hurt is actually the anti-slab community. And when I say anti-slab, I'm talking about the collectors who pride themselves on staying raw on purpose. The crack it out, read it, enjoy it, no plastic prison type of mindset. The people who reject grading, not just as a preference, but almost as a philosophy. Because for a while, that stance made a lot of sense. It did. I'll be one of the first people to admit that. And it still does in certain parts of the hobby. Everything should not be graded. But markets evolve, sentiment shifts, and sometimes what used to feel like a rebellion becomes a financial blind spot. Now, before anybody takes this the wrong way, this isn't about saying raw comics are bad. It's not about saying you need to slab everything or that enjoyment of comics is wrong, because that's not true. For clarity, it's my position that the vast majority of comics should not be slabbed. Okay? So let's get that out of the way right now. This is more about understanding how the market is actually behaving today and how psychologically liquidity and demand are starting to separate raw first collectors from slab line collectors in a way that could matter a lot more over the next cycle than people expect. Because here's the first thing we have to acknowledge. Over the last 12 months, despite a pretty uneven broader economy, the comic market has shown real strength in certain segments. Not everything, not across the board, but key books, major keys, golden age stuff specifically, and high demand issues have continued to post strong sales activity. And in some cases, we're talking about numbers that surprised even longtime collectors. You've probably seen it in the headlines or auction chat or on Instagram or Facebook groups or whatever. Major Silver Age keys are still moving. High-grade copies of cornerstone books continuing to set benchmarks. Even books like Superman 1 being discussed in the context of record-level sales activity, depending on grade, presentation, and timing. Now, whether you track those sales or you don't, whether you pay attention to heritage auctions or not, the broader signal is the same. High-end, well-graded, well-presented books are still commanding serious attention and even serious money. And that's where the split starts to matter, because in that kind of environment, liquidity starts to concentrate. Buyers become more selective. Capital starts flowing toward assets that are easy to evaluate, easy to compare, and easy to transact. And that almost always benefits graded material over raw material, especially at the higher end. A slab removes uncertainty. It standardizes condition. It gives buyers a shared language. We're not speculating at that point. It allows someone in one part of the country to trust a seller in another part of the country without needing to inspect the book in person. And whether people like that or not, that efficiency has real market value. Now compare that to raw comics in a tightening or competitive market cycle. Suddenly, condition debates get louder. Photos matter more. Trust becomes a bigger issue, and two copies of the same book can feel like completely different assets depending on how confident a buyer is in what they're seeing. This is where the anti-slab mindset starts to run into friction. Because the core philosophy of, I just want to enjoy the book raw, is completely valid on a personal level. But the market doesn't operate on personal enjoyment. It operates on standardized demand. And when demand concentrates around graded, comparable assets, raw books can start to lose out on liquidity even if they are technically identical copies. Now let's bring in another layer of psychology here, because this is where things get interesting. The anti-slab perspective often builds itself around authenticity. The idea that cracking a comic out of a slab restores it to its true form, that it's meant to be read, handled, experienced. And again, that's emotionally and culturally valid. But in investing terms, in portfolio terms, that decision has a cost attached to it that isn't always felt immediately. When you crack a slab, you're removing a standardized condition label that the market recognizes universally. You're replacing it with subjective evaluation again. And in a rising or high competition market, subjectivity tends to be penalized. That doesn't mean the comic is worth less in every case. It means the pool of buyers willing to engage, though, shrinks. And in collectible markets, shrinking your buyer pool is one of the fastest ways to create long-term downside pressure, especially if the market cools even slightly from peak momentum. Now, here's where 2026 specifically becomes important in this discussion, though. If the last stretch of the market has been characterized by strong headline sales, record-setting conversations around major keys, and continued institutional or high-end collector interest in graded books, then what tends to follow cycles like that is not immediate collapse, but segmentation. Some tiers hold, some tiers cool, and some categories start to behave differently depending on liquidity preference. In that kind of environment, slabbed comics often retain a structural advantage because they're easier to move across buyer groups. Raw comics, especially high-value ones at that, can start to rely more heavily on niche buyers who are confident in their own grading ability or who specifically want to crack and resubmit or crack and collect, one or the other. And that's a much smaller group than most people realize. So when I say the biggest losers of 2026 could be anti-slabbers, I don't mean people who prefer raw comics for enjoyment. I mean people who systematically avoid slabs, even in situations where slabs are clearly the more liquid, more widely accepted market format. Because in a strong or even moderately cooling market, liquidity is everything. And let's talk about another angle here, which you've heard me talk about many times before, but it's ego. One of the quiet truths in comic collecting is that confidence in your own grading ability can become a form of identity, right? Eyeballing grades. Some collectors genuinely believe they can beat the slab market by buying raw, grading accurately in their head, and avoiding what they see as unnecessary fees or artificial pricing structures. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes that's the case. There are absolutely scenarios where raw purchases outperform slab purchases, especially in undervalued listings, estate fines, misgraded raw books, that kind of thing. We all have seen that happen. But the ego trap happens when that belief becomes rigid, when every slab is seen as overpriced by default, when grading companies are dismissed entirely, when the possibility that the market values standardization more than personal assessment gets ignored. Because markets don't care about confidence, they care about consensus. And slabs represent consensus. That's the part a lot of anti-slab arguments miss. A slab isn't just plastic and a number, it's a signal that multiple layers of verification have already been applied and that the market can now transact around a shared baseline. Now let's bring in emotional collecting, because this is where the two sides actually overlap more than people think. Even anti-slabbers are not immune to emotional attachment. In fact, cracking a slab often increases emotional connection to a book. It becomes yours again. It becomes something you can hold, read, display without barriers. And that feeling is real and important, and I get it. I've got plenty of raw books too. But emotionally driven decisions and market optimized decisions don't always align. Those are not always the same thing. And when markets are strong, emotional decisions can feel harmless. When markets shift, they can quietly become expensive. Now, if you bought a raw book because you wanted to enjoy it, then there is no downside. But if you cracked a graded book because you believed slabs were inherently overvalued, or you listened to somebody that got ticked off during the pandemic and thought they got ripped off, and that book later becomes harder to sell or liquidate at the same level you could have exited before, then the emotional reasoning can start to clash with the financial outcome of what's going to happen. And that tension is where a lot of collector regret lives. Now zoom out again and look at the broader trend over the past year, because the hobby hasn't been shrinking, folks. If anything, certain segments have been consolidating upward. High grade, high demand comics are still finding buyers. That's just the facts. Competitive auctions are still happening for major keys. And even in uncertain economic conditions, collectibles with strong historical demand have shown remarkable resilience. Now, that doesn't guarantee future growth. I think we all know that. But it does reinforce one thing: quality and liquidity are becoming more important, not less. And slabs sit directly at that intersection. So, what happens to collectors who refuse that format entirely? Well, in a strong market, they might feel validated because raw books still move. But in a segmented or selective market, they may find themselves holding assets that require more effort to sell, more negotiation in price, and more trust to transact. And that effort translates into friction. And friction in a collectible market often translates into weaker pricing or slower exits. Which brings us back to the core idea: the anti-slab philosophy isn't going to disappear. Raw comics will always have a place in collecting culture. Reading comics raw will always matter. Enjoying comics and enjoying the hobby will always matter more than plastic. But in 2026 specifically, if current trends continue, then the collectors who completely dismiss slabs as a category rather than a tool may find themselves on the wrong side of liquidity dynamics more often than they expect. And nobody wants that. Not because they're wrong about enjoyment, but because they've removed one of the strongest standardization tools the market has ever seen, ever adopted. And markets tend to reward standardization during periods of high competition. So the real takeaway here isn't slab everything. It's understand what the slab actually represents in a modern comic market. It's not just grading, it's access, it's liquidity, it's shared language. And when those things matter most, ignoring them completely can quietly become a disadvantage. And that's why I think when we look back at this era of collecting, the winners and losers won't just be defined by what people bought. They'll be defined by how flexible they were and how they bought it. I hope this information continues to help you. Thanks for listening to Slabbed Portfolios, and I will see you guys on the next one.